September 20th, 1943. The North Atlantic, 320 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. Kapitänleutnant Erich Walter pressed his face against the cold rubber eyepiece of U-238's attack periscope, observing the distant silhouettes of the convoy as they crawled across the gray horizon. Around him, in the conning tower, 4 other men stood in practiced silence, their breathing falling into rhythm with the creaking of the pressure hull. As the Type 7C submarine rolled gently in the autumn swells, water droplets condensed on the overhead valves and ran down the painted steel in thin rivulets that caught the dim red lighting. Walter had been hunting convoys in these waters for 18 months, long enough to recognize instantly the distinctive profile of a Flower-class corvette screening the merchant ship's southern flank. The escort moved in a predictable zigzag pattern, her bow throwing white spray as she turned into the wind. Through the periscope's magnification, Walter could make out the depth charge racks on her stern and the dark gun mounting forward of the bridge. She was perhaps 3,000 meters distant, close enough that he could see individual crew members moving on her deck. His first watch officer, Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner, stood ready at the torpedo data computer, his hands resting on the brass wheels that calculated bearing, speed, and firing solutions. The young officer had joined U-238's crew only 3 patrols ago, replacing a man who had gone down with U-175 off Newfoundland. Steiner still moved with the careful precision of someone not entirely comfortable with the submarine's constant motion, though his calculations had proven reliable during their attacks on 2 stragglers earlier in the patrol. What made this attack different from the dozens Walter had conducted before was the weapon now loaded in Tube 5. The T-5 Zaunkönig acoustic homing torpedo had arrived at the U-boat bunkers in Brest just before U-238's departure, accompanied by strict orders and detailed technical briefings that emphasized both its capabilities and its revolutionary nature. Unlike the standard G7E electric torpedoes that traveled in straight lines toward manually calculated intercept points, the Zaunkönig listened for propeller noise and adjusted its course to follow its target. The weapon weighed 1,495 kilograms and carried a 274-kilogram warhead powerful enough to break a destroyer's keel. The technical officers who had supervised the weapon's loading had spoken in hushed, almost reverent tones about what the Zaunkönig represented for submarine warfare. For 2 years, Allied destroyers and corvettes had hunted U-boats with near impunity, their sonar and depth charges forcing submarines to dive deep and endure hours of terror while steel canisters detonated overhead. The acoustic torpedo changed that equation fundamentally. Now the hunters could become the hunted, and escort vessels that approached too close to defend their convoys would find themselves targeted by weapons they couldn't evade through speed or maneuvering alone. Walter had studied the technical manual during the 10-day transit from Brest to the convoy routes, memorizing the Zaunkönig's specifications and operational limitations. The torpedo could achieve 24 knots for a duration of roughly 11 minutes, powered by a battery electric motor that left almost no wake. Its passive acoustic receivers picked up frequencies between 300 and 3,000 hertz, the range that captured the distinctive cavitation noise of Allied destroyer propellers churning through water. Once launched, the weapon required no further guidance. It simply listened and followed, making minute course corrections as it closed the distance to its target. The convoy before him now presented an ideal testing opportunity. The escorts were spread thin, protecting nearly 40 merchant vessels, and the lone corvette on the southern flank was operating independently, probably maintaining radio silence while conducting her patrol pattern. If Walter could sink her with the Zaunkönig, the convoy's defensive screen would develop a critical gap through which the Wolf Pack's other boats could penetrate and savage the cargo ships carrying American supplies to Britain. Through the periscope, Walter watched the corvette complete another turn, steadying on a course that would bring her within optimal firing range. Her captain was following established doctrine, maintaining speed and changing heading at irregular intervals to complicate any potential torpedo attack. It was the same defensive pattern that had kept escorts relatively safe from submarine attack for years, predicated on the assumption that torpedoes traveled predictable paths that could be avoided through aggressive maneuvering. Walter rotated the periscope's magnification ring, bringing the escort into sharper focus. He could now distinguish individual details: the spray-wet railing around her bridge, the signal halyards running up to her mast, the white numerals painted on her bow identifying her as HMS Calendula. She displaced perhaps 900 tons, carried a 4-inch gun and multiple depth charge projectors, and maintained a speed of approximately 15 knots. Her lookouts would be scanning the horizon for periscope feathers or the telltale exhaust trails of conventional torpedoes, watching for threats they could see and avoid. In the control room below, the hydrophone operator called out bearing and propeller count information in a steady monotone, his trained ears separating the mechanical sounds of dozens of ships from the ocean's background noise. The data fed into Steiner's calculations, helping establish the corvette's course and speed with increasing precision. Walter could hear his executive officer, Lieutenant zur See Helmut Krieger, quietly directing the trim adjustments that kept U-238 at periscope depth despite the swells trying to push her up or down. The boat had been submerged for nearly 6 hours now, conserving battery power while stalking the convoy at creeping speed. The air had grown thick and stale, heavy with the smell of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and the peculiar metallic scent that came from recycled atmosphere in a sealed steel tube. 44 men breathed that same air, moving through their duties with the economical motions that came from living in a space barely 45 meters long and less than 5 meters wide. Every man aboard knew that their survival depended on remaining undetected until the moment Walter chose to strike. The tactical situation was developing exactly as Walter had hoped. The corvette's patrol pattern would bring her to within 2,000 meters in approximately 8 minutes, close enough that the Zaunkonig's acoustic seekers would have no difficulty acquiring her propeller signature. The sea state was moderate, with swells running perhaps 2 meters in height, conditions that would mask the torpedo's launch and initial run. Wind from the southwest kept the convoy making steady progress toward Britain, the merchant ships maintaining their ordered columns while their escorts prowled the formation's perimeter. Walter gave the order to flood tube 5 and open the bow cap, his voice barely above a whisper in the confined space of the conning tower. Somewhere forward in the torpedo room, 2 petty officers worked the mechanical systems that admitted seawater into the tube and swung open the external door, preparing the Zaunkönig for launch. The process added weight to the boat's bow, requiring immediate compensation through the trim system to maintain depth and attitude. Krieger handled the adjustment smoothly, his hands moving across the valve controls with practiced efficiency. The moment of launch approached with the inexorable quality of a drawn breath held too long. Walter kept his eye pressed to the periscope, watching HMS Calendula maintain her course, her crew unaware that a revolutionary weapon was being prepared specifically for their destruction. In minutes, the Kriegsmarine would discover whether the Zaunkönig lived up to its promise, whether the technical officer's confidence was justified, whether the balance of power in the Atlantic was about to shift decisively in Germany's favor. Steiner called out the final firing solution, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline that made his fingers tremble slightly on the calculator wheels. Range 2,100 meters, bearing 347 degrees. Target speed 15 knots on course 090. The numbers represented HMS Calendula's predicted position at the moment the Zaunkönig would arrive, the intersection point where torpedo and target would meet in mutual destruction. Walter verified the solution against his own observations through the periscope, found it accurate within acceptable margins, and gave the order to fire. The boat shuddered as compressed air ejected the torpedo from tube 5. Walter felt the familiar lurch through the deck plates as 1,495 kilograms of steel and explosives left the submarine. The sudden weight loss required immediate flooding of compensating tanks to prevent U-238 from broaching the surface. The Zaunkönig's electric motor engaged automatically upon clearing the tube, its propeller beginning the steady rotation that would carry it toward the target while simultaneously generating the noise signature its own acoustic sensors would use to distinguish between its own sound and the corvette's louder cavitation. Through the periscope, Walter watched for the weapon's wake. The Zaunkönig ran at 6 meters depth, deep enough that it produced almost no surface disturbance despite its 24-knot speed. Only a faint discoloration in the water marked its passage, a subtle darkening that would be invisible to lookouts scanning from the corvette's bridge. The technical specifications had promised this near invisibility, and watching the torpedoes run confirmed that the weapon designers had delivered on that particular claim. 43 seconds after launch, Walter saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. HMS Calendula, maintaining her steady patrol pattern with no apparent awareness of danger, suddenly heeled into a sharp turn to starboard. Her rudder went hard over, bringing her bow around in a tight arc that threw spray across the forward deck and caused her stern to skid through the water. The maneuver was executed with such abruptness that Walter could see crew members grabbing railings for support as the corvette leaned into the turn. The timing was impossible to explain. The Zaunkönig was still more than 1,500 meters from its target, running silently beneath the surface with no visible wake or exhaust trail. There had been no lookout's warning shout, no sudden alarm that would explain the corvette's evasive action. Yet HMS Calendula was turning with the desperate urgency of a ship whose captain knew exactly what was approaching and from which direction. Walter kept his eye locked to the periscope, tracking both the corvette's maneuver and the estimated position of his torpedo. The Zaunkönig's acoustic seekers would have detected the target's propeller noise by now, would have begun making the small course corrections designed to maintain pursuit. But the corvette's sharp turn had taken her off the weapon's projected intercept course, forcing the torpedo to adjust its bearing by perhaps 40 degrees to reacquire the target. The homing mechanism was designed for such corrections, but the geometry of pursuit had been compromised. The corvette steadied on her new course for perhaps 20 seconds, her propellers thrashing white water as she maintained maximum speed. Then she turned again, this time to port, executing another violent maneuver that brought her through nearly 90 degrees of heading change in less than 30 seconds. Walter watched the display with growing disbelief. The captain of HMS Calendula was maneuvering as though he could see the torpedo, as though he possessed some form of supernatural awareness that allowed him to track an invisible weapon running 6 meters beneath the surface. Steiner had moved to stand beside Walter in the conning tower, abandoning his position at the torpedo calculator to observe the unfolding situation firsthand. The young officer's face showed confusion, mixed with concern. Every U-boat commander knew that escorts occasionally executed random evasive maneuvers. That defensive doctrine called for frequent course changes to complicate torpedo attacks. But this was different. HMS Calendula was not zigzagging randomly. She was reacting deliberately, turning at specific moments that suggested her captain knew precisely when and where to maneuver to avoid an incoming threat. The Zaunkönig runtime was approaching 2 minutes. The weapon carried enough battery power for approximately 11 minutes of operation, but every course correction required to maintain pursuit consumed additional energy and extended the time to target. Walter calculated distances and speeds in his head, trying to determine whether the torpedo would run out of power before achieving its objective. The mathematics were uncomfortably close and depended entirely on whether the corvette's captain would finally stop his evasive maneuvering. HMS Calendula turned again. This time, the maneuver was less violent, a gradual swing to starboard that suggested her captain was balancing the need for evasion against the requirement to maintain station on the convoy's flank. Through the periscope's optics, Walter could see signal flags being run up the corvette's halyards, probably alerting other escorts to the submarine's presence. The defensive screen would be converging on U-238's estimated position within minutes, bringing their sonar and depth charges to bear on a target they couldn't yet locate but knew was present. The hydrophone operator's voice cut through the tense silence in the control room, reporting increased propeller noise from multiple bearings. Other escorts were accelerating, moving to support HMS Calendula and establish a barrier between the submarine and the convoy. Standard doctrine dictated that Walter should break off the attack, go deep, and attempt to slip away before the hunting force could establish contact. But he kept his eye to the periscope, watching the corvette's continuing evasions, trying to understand what technology or technique was allowing her captain to dodge a weapon he shouldn't be able to detect. The Zaunkönig runtime passed 3 minutes. The weapon would still be pursuing its target, its acoustic sensors locked onto the corvette's propeller signature, its guidance system making constant corrections to maintain an intercept course. But each of HMS Calendula's violent turns forced the torpedo further off the optimal pursuit geometry, extended the chase, and consumed battery power that couldn't be replenished. Walter had fired the weapon with confidence born from technical briefings and testing reports. Now that confidence was eroding as he watched an Allied escort vessel perform maneuvers that should have been impossible. Krieger called up from the control room, his voice carrying a note of urgency. The other escorts were closing rapidly, their propeller signatures growing louder on the hydrophones. U-238 had perhaps 2 minutes before the first destroyer would be in sonar range, perhaps 4 minutes before depth charges would begin detonating overhead. The tactical situation was deteriorating with each passing second, and the Zaunkönig showed no signs of achieving its objective. Through the periscope, Walter saw HMS Calendula execute yet another turn, this one bringing her through nearly 120 degrees of heading change. The corvette's wake formed a white serpentine pattern across the gray Atlantic swells. It was visible evidence of maneuvering that seemed to follow some pattern Walter couldn't decipher. He had watched dozens of Allied escorts over 18 months of combat patrols, had studied their tactics and learned to predict their movements. This was something entirely new, a defensive technique that suggested the corvette possessed information or capabilities that German intelligence had not identified. The Zaunkonig's runtime approached 4 minutes. Walter made the decision to go deep, his training and experience overriding the desire to maintain observation of the impossible scene unfolding before him. He snapped the periscope handles up and stepped back, allowing the device to descend into its well with a hydraulic hiss. The order to dive to 150 meters came automatically, followed by commands to rig for silent running and prepare for depth charge attack. As U-238's bow angled downward and the boat began her descent into the dark water, Walter stood in the control room and contemplated what he had just witnessed. The Zaunkönig was supposed to be unstoppable, a weapon that would restore Germany's advantage in the Atlantic War. Instead, he had watched an Allied corvette dodge it with apparent ease, maneuvering as though guided by some form of advanced warning that should not have existed. Somewhere in the darkness above, his acoustic torpedo was still hunting, still following its target's propeller noise, burning through the last of its battery power in pursuit of a corvette whose captain knew exactly when to turn. The first depth charge detonated 100 meters off U-238's port quarter. The concussive shock transmitted through the water and into the pressure hull with a sound like a massive hammer striking an anvil. The lights flickered as the boat shuddered, and condensation mist appeared briefly in the colder air of the control room. Walter gripped the chart table's edge and watched his crew maintain their positions, each man focused on his specific duty, while the ocean around them erupted with high explosives. Krieger stood at the diving station, his eyes moving between the depth gauge and the bubble indicator that showed the boat's trim. 160 meters now, well below the safe operating depth, but still vulnerable to a well-placed pattern of charges. The executive officer ordered subtle adjustments to the hydroplanes, keeping U-238 in a controlled descent that would take her deeper into the protective darkness. Every man aboard knew the pressure hull's limits, knew that somewhere beyond 200 meters the welded seams would begin to weep and the hull plates would start to groan under the crushing weight of the Atlantic. 3 more charges detonated in rapid succession. Closer now. The explosions created pressure waves that squeezed the submarine from multiple directions simultaneously, testing every rivet and seal. In the torpedo room, unsecured equipment clattered against bulkheads. The sound of rushing water appeared briefly from somewhere aft, then stopped as damage control parties closed valves and tightened packing glands. Paint chips drifted down from the overhead like snow. Walter listened to the pattern of detonations and recognized the systematic approach of an experienced escort commander. The charges were being dropped in an expanding spiral centered on U-238's last known position, each pattern designed to cover a sector where the submarine might have maneuvered after diving. The corvette captain was methodical and patient, willing to expend depth charges until either his racks were empty or U-238 was destroyed. HMS Calendula had dodged the Zaunkönig, and now her crew was prosecuting the attack with professional competence that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. The hydrophone operator reported propeller noise from 3 bearings, confirming that multiple escorts had joined the hunt. Walter could picture the tactical situation developing on the surface above him. Corvettes and destroyers working in coordination, their sonar operators listening for the slightest mechanical noise that would betray U-238's position, their deck crews preparing charge patterns that would saturate suspected locations with explosive force. The convoy would have altered course by now, putting distance between the merchant ships and the submarine threat, while the escorts remained behind to prosecute contact. Another pattern of charges detonated, these ones further away as the hunting force searched sectors where they believed U-238 might have moved. Walter ordered the boat to 180 meters and reduced to minimum speed, barely maintaining steerage way. At this depth and speed, U-238 became nearly silent, her electric motors producing only a faint hum that water pressure and distance would mask from enemy hydrophones. The crew shifted to silent routine, communicating through hand signals and whispered words, moving with exaggerated care to avoid any sound that might reach the hunting escorts above. The attack continued for 90 minutes. Charges fell in patterns that gradually moved away from U-238's position as the escort commanders searched expanding sectors. Walter tracked their movements through the hydrophone reports, building a mental picture of where each hunting vessel was located and how the search pattern was developing. The escorts were working outward from the initial contact position, covering each sector methodically before moving to the next. It was textbook anti-submarine warfare, executed with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of convoy protection duty. When the propeller noises finally faded and the depth charge attack ceased, U-238 remained at depth for another hour. Walter sat on the fold-down seat in the control room and replayed the attack sequence in his mind, examining each moment from the Zaunkonig's launch to HMS Calendula's first evasive turn. The timing had been too precise to be coincidence. The corvette had begun maneuvering within seconds of the torpedo's launch, well before any conventional detection method could have provided warning. The pattern suggested advanced knowledge, some form of early warning system that allowed Allied escorts to detect acoustic torpedoes long before those weapons posed an immediate threat. Krieger approached quietly and spoke in a voice low enough that only Walter could hear. The executive officer had been running calculations during the depth charge attack, using the observed evasions to estimate the corvette captain's reaction time. By Krieger's estimates, HMS Calendula had begun her first turn approximately 45 seconds after the Zaunkonig's launch. At that moment, the torpedo would have been roughly 1,500 meters from its target, running silently at 6 meters depth with no surface wake or exhaust trail. There was no known technology that would allow detection at that range and under those conditions. The discussion continued in hushed tones while U-238 crept through the deep water. Steiner joined them, offering his own observations about the corvette's maneuvers. The pattern of turns had not been random zigzagging. Each course change had occurred at intervals that roughly corresponded to the Zaunkönig position relative to the target. It was as though the corvette's captain could track the torpedo's approach and time his evasions to stay ahead of the weapon's pursuit geometry. The young officer suggested that perhaps the Allies had developed some form of listening device sensitive enough to detect torpedo propeller noise at extended ranges. Walter considered the possibility carefully. The Zaunkönig's electric motor was designed to run quietly, producing far less noise than the corvette's own propulsion system. But perhaps Allied hydrophone technology had advanced beyond what German intelligence estimated. Perhaps the escorts carried specialized listening equipment capable of filtering out their own propeller noise and detecting the fainter signature of an approaching torpedo. It would explain the timing of HMS Calendula's evasions and the precision with which her captain had maneuvered to avoid the weapon. The theory troubled Walter for multiple reasons. If the Allies possessed such technology, then the Zaunkönig's primary advantage had been neutralized before the weapon even entered service. The acoustic torpedo was supposed to force Allied escorts to choose between defending their convoys and exposing themselves to attack. If escorts could detect and evade Zaunkönig attacks while maintaining their defensive positions, then the tactical equation remained unchanged. U-boats would still be forced to attack through defensive screens, still face the overwhelming advantage Allied anti-submarine forces had developed through sonar, radar, and coordinated tactics. U-238 began her ascent to periscope depth. As darkness fell across the North Atlantic, the hydrophones detected no propeller noise, suggesting the escorts had abandoned the search and rejoined their convoy. Walter raised the periscope cautiously and scanned the empty horizon, finding only gray seas and gathering twilight. The convoy was long gone, steaming eastward toward Britain with its cargo of American supplies intact. One corvette had survived an attack by Germany's newest weapon, and U-238 had accomplished nothing except wasting one irreplaceable acoustic torpedo. The transit back to Brest took 11 days. Walter composed his patrol report during the journey, documenting the Zaunkönig attack and HMS Calendula's evasions in clinical detail. He noted the timing of the corvette's turns, the pattern of maneuvers, the apparent advanced warning that seemed to guide the escort's defensive actions. The report raised questions Walter couldn't answer with confidence. What technology allowed detection of acoustic torpedoes at such ranges? How widespread was this capability among Allied escorts? Had the Zaunkönig program been compromised before it could achieve tactical success? Other boats from the Wolfpack transmitted contact reports during the return voyage. Their messages were decoded in U-238's radio room and brought to Walter for review. U-615 had attacked a destroyer with a Zaunkönig and watched the target execute evasive maneuvers similar to those Walter had observed. U-441 reported firing 2 acoustic torpedoes at separate escorts and seeing both targets dodge successfully through what the commander described as impossible foreknowledge of the weapon's approach. The pattern was consistent across multiple attacks. Allied escorts were detecting and evading Zaunkönig torpedoes with a success rate that suggested systematic capability rather than random chance. The implications were devastating for the U-boat force. The Kriegsmarine had invested substantial resources in developing the acoustic torpedo, diverting production capacity and technical expertise from other programs to create a weapon that would restore Germany's advantage in the Atlantic War. Now, after only weeks of operational use, the weapon appeared to be compromised by some Allied countermeasure that German intelligence had failed to identify. Walter wondered how many other U-boat commanders were composing similar reports, documenting similar failures, reaching similar conclusions about the Zaunkönigs' effectiveness against enemies who could somehow detect weapons they shouldn't be able to sense. U-238 entered the massive concrete U-boat bunker at Brest on October 3rd, her diesel engines echoing off the reinforced ceiling as she maneuvered through the entrance channel. Walter stood on the bridge, watching the bunker's interior swallow his boat. The structure's scale still impressed him even after multiple returns from patrol. The bunker's roof measured more than 6 meters thick, designed to withstand even the heaviest Allied bombs, and the interior pens provided maintenance facilities for a dozen submarines simultaneously. Overhead lights reflected off the dark water, creating rippling patterns on the concrete walls that surrounded them. The debriefing began 3 hours after docking. Walter sat across a metal desk from Korvettenkapitän Franz Becker, the staff intelligence officer responsible for analyzing patrol reports from the 7th U-boat flotilla. Becker was perhaps 40 years old, his face showing the pallor of someone who spent most of his time in underground bunkers rather than at sea. He had Walter's written report spread before him, along with similar documents from other commanders, and his expression suggested he had been reading variations of the same disturbing story for weeks. Becker asked Walter to describe the HMS Calendula attack in precise detail, particularly focusing on the timing and nature of the corvette's evasive maneuvers. Walter walked through the sequence chronologically, noting when he had fired the Zaunkönig, when the corvette had begun turning, how the pattern of evasions had continued throughout the weapon's run. Becker made notes in the margins of the report, occasionally asking for clarification about distances or timing intervals. The intelligence officer's questions were specific and technical, suggesting he was building some form of composite analysis from multiple patrol reports. The conversation shifted to Walter's theory about Allied listening devices. Becker listened without comment as Walter outlined his speculation about advanced hydrophone technology capable of detecting torpedo propeller noise at extended ranges. When Walter finished, Becker opened a folder and extracted several photographs showing what appeared to be damaged electronic equipment recovered from wreckage. The devices looked primitive, collections of vacuum tubes and wire coils mounted in waterproof housings, but Becker explained they represented Allied technology captured from a destroyer sunk off Norway in August. The equipment was designated FXR gear by British Naval Communications that German signals intelligence had intercepted and partially decoded. Becker's technical analysis team had examined the captured devices and determined they functioned as specialized acoustic receivers, tuned to detect propeller cavitation in specific frequency ranges. The system allowed Allied escorts to hear torpedo motors at distances exceeding 1,000 meters, providing advanced warning that gave captains sufficient time to execute evasive maneuvers. The devices were simple in concept, but remarkably effective in practice, turning the Zaunkonig's homing capability into a liability rather than an advantage. Walter studied the photographs with growing dismay. The technology was not sophisticated by German engineering standards. The vacuum tubes were standard commercial types. The circuit design was straightforward, and the entire assembly could probably be manufactured in any moderately equipped electronics workshop. What made the FXR gear effective was not technological superiority, but rather the fundamental insight that acoustic torpedoes created their own detection signature. The Zaunkonig's designers had focused on making the weapon quiet relative to conventional torpedoes, but had not considered that even reduced propeller noise might be detectable by sufficiently sensitive listening equipment. Becker explained that intelligence estimates suggested FXR gear had been deployed to convoy escorts beginning in July, approximately 2 months before the Zaunkönig entered operational service. The timing meant that Allied defenses against acoustic torpedoes had been established before German submarines fired their first weapons in combat. British naval intelligence had apparently anticipated the development of acoustic homing torpedoes and developed countermeasures preemptively, achieving a defensive advantage that rendered the German weapon largely ineffective from its first operational use. The scope of the intelligence failure became clearer as Becker outlined what his analysis team had reconstructed. British technical publications from before the war had discussed acoustic detection methods and torpedo tracking systems, but German naval intelligence had dismissed these papers as theoretical speculation rather than practical development programs. Allied convoy escorts had been observed making seemingly random course changes during 1942 and early 1943 at maneuvers that German analysts had attributed to defensive doctrine rather than equipment testing. Signals intelligence had intercepted references to FXR systems, but had not recognized the designation as relating to torpedo detection gear. Multiple organizational failures had contributed to the situation. German naval intelligence focused primarily on tracking Allied ship movements and convoy routes rather than analyzing technological developments. The technical bureaus responsible for torpedo development had not coordinated adequately with intelligence services to assess potential Allied countermeasures. Fleet commanders had pressed for rapid deployment of the Zaunkönig without requiring comprehensive testing against realistic defensive scenarios. The result was a weapon that entered service with fundamental vulnerabilities that proper intelligence assessment might have identified before operational deployment. Walter asked whether the FXR gear could be defeated through tactical modifications or technical improvements to the Zaunkönig. Becker's response was pessimistic. The Allied detection system worked by listening for any propeller noise above ambient ocean background levels. Making the torpedo quieter would require either reducing its speed, which would decrease effective range and pursuit capability, or redesigning the propulsion system entirely, which would delay production for months or years. Tactical modifications like firing from closer ranges would expose submarines to greater risk from escort counterattacks, without guaranteeing successful hits against targets that could detect weapons before they closed to lethal range. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics that ranged from specific patrol experiences to broader strategic implications. Becker was compiling a comprehensive assessment for Befehlshaber der U-Boote headquarters, the supreme command authority for all U-boat operations. His report would document the Zaunkönig failure rate, analyze the effectiveness of Allied countermeasures, and provide recommendations about whether to continue acoustic torpedo production or reallocate resources to other weapons programs. The data from Walter's patrol and dozens of similar missions painted a clear picture. The weapon that was supposed to revolutionize submarine warfare had been neutralized before achieving significant operational impact. Other commanders from the 7th Flotilla provided similar testimony over the following days. Kapitänleutnant Gustav Zimmermann from U-66 described firing 3 Zaunkönig torpedoes at different escorts during a single convoy battle and watching all 3 targets evade successfully through precisely timed maneuvers. Corvettenkapitän Werner Schmidt from U-270 reported that his acoustic torpedo had been detected and evaded by a destroyer that then counterattacked with such speed and accuracy that U-270 barely escaped destruction. Commander after commander recounted variations of the same experience. Weapons fired with confidence based on technical specifications and training. Targets that evaded through apparent foreknowledge. Submarines forced to withdraw without achieving successful attacks. The psychological impact on the U-boat force was substantial. Crews had endured increasingly dangerous conditions in the North Atlantic throughout 1942 and 1943, sustained by promises that new weapons would restore Germany's tactical advantage. The Zaunkönig represented hope that submarines could once again sink Allied shipping faster than replacement vessels could be built, that escort forces could be depleted through attrition, that the Atlantic War might still be won despite mounting losses. Now that hope was revealed as illusion based on optimistic assessments that had not accounted for Allied technological countermeasures. Walter spent 3 days in Brest before U-238's next patrol assignment. He walked through the town's damaged streets, past buildings that Allied bombers had reduced to rubble, and contemplated the broader implications of what he had witnessed. The Zaunkönig's failure was not merely a tactical setback, but evidence of a larger pattern. German technological development was falling behind Allied innovation in multiple critical areas: radar, sonar, signals intelligence, code breaking, production capacity. In each domain, the enemy appeared to be matching or exceeding German capabilities. The certainty that had characterized the war's early years was being replaced by doubt about whether victory remained achievable. The new patrol orders arrived on October 6th. U-238 would return to the North Atlantic convoy routes, this time operating as part of a larger Wolfpack designated Group Schlieffen. The operational plan called for coordinated attacks against convoys identified through signals intelligence, with submarines using conventional torpedoes rather than relying on the compromised Zaunkönig weapons. Walter read the orders with the detachment that came from accepting circumstances he could not change. He would take his boat back to sea, hunt Allied shipping with whatever weapons remained effective, and try to survive long enough to return to port once more. The comprehensive intelligence assessment reached Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters in Berlin on October 18, 1943. The report ran to 47 pages and included patrol data from 23 U-boats that had deployed Zaunkönig torpedoes during September and early October. The statistics were damning. 51 acoustic torpedoes fired at Allied escorts with only 4 confirmed sinkings and 3 probable hits. The success rate of less than 8% compared catastrophically with the 90% effectiveness predicted during weapons testing against non-evading targets in the Baltic. Dönitz convened his senior staff to review the findings in a conference room deep beneath the Kriegsmarine headquarters complex. Present were the officers responsible for U-boat operations, weapons development, intelligence analysis, and tactical doctrine. The meeting began at 10 o'clock in the morning and continued past midnight as staff officers presented data, argued interpretations, and attempted to identify solutions to a problem that appeared to have no satisfactory resolution. The technical analysis section of the report explained in precise detail how FXR gear functioned and why it was so effective against acoustic torpedoes. The Allied detection system exploited a fundamental characteristic that could not be eliminated without abandoning the homing guidance mechanism entirely. The Zaunkönig needed to generate propeller noise to move through water, and that noise signature, regardless of how quiet German engineers made it, could be detected by sufficiently sensitive acoustic receivers. The physics were inescapable. Any self-propelled torpedo created sound, and sound could be heard by equipment designed for that specific purpose. Weapons development officers proposed modifications that might reduce the torpedo's detectability. Perhaps the Zaunkönig could run at slower speeds, producing less cavitation noise. Perhaps the propeller design could be altered to change the acoustic frequency, moving it outside the range FXR gear could detect. Perhaps the weapon could be programmed to approach targets in a spiral pattern rather than direct pursuit, complicating the defensive captain's ability to predict its course. Each proposal was examined and found wanting. Speed reduction would make the weapon ineffective against maneuvering targets. Frequency changes would require complete propulsion redesign. Spiral approaches would extend runtime beyond battery capacity. The intelligence assessment included translated excerpts from Allied naval communications that German signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded. British Admiralty messages referenced FXR gear deployment to convoy escorts beginning in July, with priority given to vessels operating in areas where U-boat activity was highest. Technical specifications for the detection equipment had been distributed to escort commanders along with tactical guidance on how to recognize torpedo approach signatures and execute optimal evasive maneuvers. The communications revealed that Allied naval leadership had anticipated German acoustic torpedo development and implemented countermeasures as part of a coordinated defensive strategy. What particularly troubled Dönitz and his staff was the timeline. Allied development of FXR gear had apparently begun in 1942, possibly earlier, based on the assumption that German engineers would eventually produce acoustic homing torpedoes. British technical intelligence had correctly predicted the weapon's characteristics and designed detection systems specifically to defeat it. The Kriegsmarine's supposed secret weapon had been compromised before entering service, undermined by enemy intelligence efforts that had outpaced German operational security and technical development. The operational analysis section examined broader patterns in Atlantic convoy battles. U-boat losses had increased dramatically during 1943, rising from an average of 15 boats per month in early spring to more than 30 per month by autumn. Allied escorts were sinking submarines faster than German shipyards could replace them, and the kill ratio had shifted decisively in favor of anti-submarine forces. Technological factors contributed significantly to this reversal. Allied aircraft carried improved radar that could detect surfaced U-boats at night. Escort vessels deployed better sonar systems with greater detection ranges. Convoy tactics had evolved to provide overlapping defensive coverage that made penetration increasingly difficult. The Zaunkönig failure represented one element in a larger pattern of Allied technological superiority. German intelligence had underestimated enemy capabilities across multiple domains. The extent of Allied radar development, the sophistication of signals intelligence networks, the industrial capacity available for mass-producing detection equipment. In each area, German assessments had proven overly optimistic, and the assumption that German engineering excellence would maintain qualitative superiority over numerically superior Allied forces was being disproven through accumulated combat experience. Staff officers presented calculations about the Atlantic War's sustainability. U-boat construction rates could not replace operational losses at current attrition levels. Crew training programs could not produce qualified submariners fast enough to maintain fleet strength. Allied merchant ship production vastly exceeded sinking rates, with American shipyards alone launching Liberty ships faster than all German U-boats combined could destroy them. The mathematics pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. Germany was losing the Battle of the Atlantic through a combination of numerical inferiority and technological disadvantage that would only worsen as the war continued. Dönitz faced decisions that offered no satisfactory options. He could continue acoustic torpedo production despite their demonstrated ineffectiveness, wasting resources on weapons that Allied escorts could detect and evade. He could order U-boats to rely exclusively on conventional torpedoes, accepting that attacks on well-defended convoys would produce minimal results at maximum risk. He could withdraw submarines from North Atlantic convoy routes entirely, conceding control of the supply lines that sustained British and Soviet resistance. Each alternative represented failure in different forms, acknowledgement that the strategic initiative had passed irretrievably to the enemy. The conference concluded with orders to continue Zaunkönig production at reduced rates while technical bureaus investigated possible improvements. U-boat operations would emphasize attacks on poorly defended targets and independent ships rather than strongly escorted convoys. Tactical doctrine would shift toward preserving the submarine force rather than accepting heavy losses in pursuit of sinking tonnage that could be easily replaced. The directives represented strategic retreat, recognition that Germany could no longer contest Allied control of the Atlantic sea lanes. Walter received notification of the new operational priorities when U-238 returned from her next patrol in early November. The boat had spent 3 weeks hunting convoys without firing a single torpedo, unable to penetrate escort screens that had become increasingly sophisticated and aggressive. Other commanders reported similar experiences. Convoys that maneuvered as coordinated units, escorts that responded to contacts with overwhelming force, aircraft that appeared with disturbing frequency despite operations conducted hundreds of miles from land bases. The pattern that had begun with HMS Calendula dodging a single Zaunkönig had expanded into systematic Allied dominance of Atlantic warfare. German U-boats still operated in those waters, still posed threats that required defensive resources to counter, but they no longer represented the existential danger they had during 1942. The technological and tactical advantages had shifted decisively, driven by Allied innovation that German intelligence had failed to detect and German industry could not match. In the 7th Flotilla's operations room, staff officers tracked the diminishing returns from each patrol cycle. Fewer merchant ships sunk, more U-boats lost, longer intervals between successful attacks. The maps showed Allied convoy routes crisscrossing the Atlantic with increasing frequency, while German patrol zones contracted toward coastal waters, where defensive aircraft made operations nearly impossible. The visual representation confirmed what operational data had already demonstrated. The weapon designed to restore German naval superiority had instead revealed how thoroughly Allied technology had surpassed it. Walter stood in U-238's conning tower during a December patrol and watched a distant convoy steam past unmolested, its escorts positioned with mathematical precision to provide overlapping defensive coverage. He thought about the moment when HMS Calendula had first turned to evade his Zaunkönig, the impossible timing that had signaled capabilities German intelligence had not anticipated. That single evasion had been the first visible evidence of a technological revolution that would determine the Atlantic War's outcome more decisively than any number of torpedoes or depth charges could achieve. The realization settled over the U-boat force like winter darkness descending across northern waters. Allied escorts could detect acoustic torpedoes before those weapons closed to lethal range. Allied technology had leapfrogged German innovation in the one domain where submarines operated. The hunters had learned to hear what was hunting them, and in that hearing had found the means to survive what should have been unstoppable weapons.